Have you ever caught yourself feeling something strange when standing before ancient clocks? On the surface, it's a tourist attraction. A beautiful face, figures, a bell, a crowd with phones. Yet something unsettling still stirs inside, as if it's not a town square decoration, but someone else's device. As if it hangs here, not for us. And the worst part is something else. We've looked at such things as mere scenery for too long. We've been conditioned to believe it's just medieval beauty, the fruit of craftsmen's perseverance. Men who supposedly, in dirty workshops by candlelight, assembled machines whose precision even modern engineers still can't calmly explain. But what if this isn't a clock in the usual sense? What if it's not a device for measuring the day, but a mechanism for counting down epochs? What if the skeleton on the tower doesn't ring to entertain tourists, but because that chime was once a warning? And what if those who lived before us knew about Earth's cycles, recurring catastrophes, the ruptures in history far more than our textbooks tell us? Today we won't look at the Prague Astronomical Clock or the Strasbourg Cathedral Clock through the eyes of a tourist. We'll look at them as a trace, as evidence, as a metallic document from a vanished world. We'll figure out why these mechanisms are too complex for their official era, why their logic doesn't fit a mundane purpose, why the cities where they stand don't resemble the cities that supposedly built them, and why perhaps, right above our heads for centuries, something far more unsettling than just time has been ticking. Right where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel, thank you. We were deceived not in the details, not in the dates, not in individual names, not in the pretty legends about masters and kings. The deception is far deeper. It concerns time itself. We were taught that time is a straight ruler, that history moves forward, that yesterday was worse, today is better, and tomorrow will be better still. Against this backdrop, ancient tower clocks are presented as cute monuments to the past, as decorative toys from an era painted for us as dirty, poor, dark, and almost helpless. We're asked to believe that people, barely staying afloat amidst plagues, wars, and ignorance, suddenly created machines whose internal logic alone should blow a modern person's mind. And the most dangerous thing about this scheme is precisely its familiarity. There's a tower, there's a clock. They've stood for ages. Everyone's used to them. Tourists take photos, guides drone learned phrases, school children yawn, while the main thing is hidden in plain sight. Because no one asks the simple question, what exactly are we looking at? Not in general terms, not in a museum manner, but in essence. What level of knowledge, what level of metalworking, what level of calculation was needed for such a thing to even appear? Why did we meekly accept a version where monstrously complex mechanisms suddenly arise in a world where, as we're also told, people barely knew how to survive? This is where the most unpleasant part begins. The moment you stop seeing these objects as a pretty postcard backdrop, everything changes. What's before you is no longer a monument. What's before you are traces of something much greater, traces of a system, traces of a world where time was understood differently. And that's precisely why ancient clocks evoke that icy feeling that's hard to put into words. It's as if they continue to operate not by our logic, as if their purpose was always broader than simply telling the crowd in the square what time it is. And if that's the case, then the entire further conversation won't be about craftsmanship or beauty. Then it will be about a substitution of meaning, about the fact that right above our heads for centuries hangs a mechanism we've forgotten how to read. Which means we first need to understand the most important thing, why these structures simply cannot be called just clocks. If you look just a bit more closely at the Prague Astronomical Clock or the Strasbourg Cathedral Clock, it becomes clear. What's before us is not a household appliance. Ordinary clocks should be understandable at a glance. They must give an answer quickly, the hour, the minutes, at most the calendar date. But here, everything is arranged differently. These dials are overloaded. They are multi-layered. They seem demonstratively unwilling to be convenient for a casual passerby. There's not one scale, but several. Not one time, but several times. Not just day and night, but the sun's position, the moon's movement, zodiac signs, calendar cycles, complex coincidences of celestial rhythms. This resembles not a clock, but the control panel of a complex calculating machine. And here a very uncomfortable question arises. Who was all this for? For the merchant in the square? For the cobbler? For the random pilgrim? Why would an ordinary townsman need to know what even a well-educated person today might not always grasp without preparation? Why hang a giant mechanism over the street that doesn't just tell time, but models the sky? There's only one logical answer: because its purpose was different. It was created not as a convenient city service. It was part of a system where what mattered was not daily convenience, but the tracking of large cycles, rhythms, coincidences, patterns. The most important point here is that these objects aren't just beautiful, they are functional. Their beauty is secondary. At their core is calculation. And if it's calculation, then someone translated the movements of celestial bodies, calendar sequences, and complex astronomical dependencies into the language of gears, axles, levers, and scales. This is no longer art in the usual sense. This is engineering hidden within architecture. This is an analog computer masquerading as a church ornament. That's precisely why the word clock is dangerous in this story. It's reassuring. It makes the object smaller, more understandable, harmless. But the moment we abandon this convenient label logic, the real conversation begins. Because then we inevitably have to confront the fact that the official version rests on one old, all too convenient fairy tale. The tale of the genius master who supposedly achieved the impossible almost single-handedly. Official history loves the same trick. Whenever an object appears that sticks out too much from the overall picture, we're given a lone hero, almost a magician, almost a saint of craftsmanship. We're told that somewhere in the dim light of a workshop sat a man with amazing talent, incredible patience, who for years crafted parts, assembling a masterpiece that would astonish descendants for centuries. It's a beautiful story, convenient, almost cinematic, but there's one problem. It doesn't withstand even the simplest engineering analysis. A complex mechanism isn't born from inspiration. It's born from an environment. Tools are needed, precise measurements are needed, templates are needed, ways to reproduce parts not once, but consistently, materials of the required quality, knowledge about loads, friction, wear, tolerances, a language of calculation, and most importantly, a system where all this already exists not as a miracle, but as the norm. One person can assemble a device, sometimes even a great device, but they cannot single-handedly spawn an entire technological level that is absent around them. That's why legends of the great master are so suspicious. They don't explain the origin of the technology, they plug a hole in the explanation. They allow us to avoid asking the next question. Where did this master get the conditions to make something no one around him could make? Where are his tools? Where is his school? Where are his predecessors? Where is his production base? Where are the masters who replicated this level? Why didn't the miracle trigger an avalanche of similar machines based on the same principles? This is precisely where the substitution is felt. We aren't given an explanation for the technology's origin. We are offered a legend instead of a chain of causes. And when the legend becomes too strained, it's reinforced with a romantic haze, stories of envy, the blinding of masters, the uniqueness of genius. Although the truth might be much simpler and more unpleasant. Perhaps the names we know are not the names of creators. Perhaps they are the names of people who tried to understand an already finished system. And to feel how dangerous such a thought is for the official narrative, one must go deeper, to the gears themselves, to the metal, to the shape of the teeth, and to the precision that shouldn't have existed in the era these objects are attributed to. The most destructive part of this story doesn't begin at the level of beautiful facades or legends. It begins in the iron, in the teeth of the gears, in the mating of surfaces, in how one element fits into another, how force is transmitted, how the system doesn't jam, doesn't wear out, doesn't fall apart after a week of work. When a person is far from mechanics, a gear seems like just a circle with teeth. But an engineer knows. Everything is decided by the profile, the pitch, the symmetry, the machining precision, the coaxiality, the quality of the metal, the repeatability of manufacture. A tiny error, and the mechanism begins to die. That's why ancient astronomical clocks are so frightening when viewed without the guided tour fairy tale. Because what's before us isn't a blacksmith's crude product. It's a system where many parts must work as a single organism. This requires not just a master's hand, but a precise production culture. Here, one can't get by with just hammers, an anvil, and inspiration. This requires a world that knows how to create tools to create tools. A world where precision isn't an accident, but a technological habit. The question of the tooth profile looks especially suspicious. Smooth force transmission isn't magic, it's geometry. And not everyday geometry, but very precise geometry. If the parts truly possess the mating quality attributed to them, then what we have isn't a craft level, but the trace of a developed school of calculation and metalworking. And with that, other questions surface. How was the metal smelted? How was its homogeneity ensured? How was wear controlled? How was the form maintained in manufacturing large and small parts that must match not roughly, but within tolerances allowing long-term operation? And here the official history begins to crumble in a particularly ugly way. Because explaining the general image is still possible. One can say genius, tradition, craft secret, but metal tolerates fairy tales very poorly. A gear is either made to a level that allows it to work within a complex system, or it isn't. And if it's made to that level, then behind it stands a civilization with a far more serious technological foundation than the one shown to us in the schoolbook picture of the past. And that's a conclusion one can't escape, especially when we move to the next layer. To what exactly these mechanisms calculate. One can still argue about the complexity of metalworking. One can try to steer the conversation towards skill, traditions, the uniqueness of individual craftsmen. But when it comes to the astronomical part of these clocks, things get truly tight. Because here, it's not enough to machine a precise part. Here, one must understand what that part is supposed to calculate. One must know celestial cycles. One must translate the motion of celestial bodies into a system of mechanical ratios. One must link observation and mathematics so that pieces of metal on a tower reproduce the order of the heavens. This is precisely what makes the Prague Orloj and the Strasbourg mechanism so suspicious. They aren't limited to earthly time. They look higher. They incorporate not just the passage of the day, but more complex rhythms, lunar phases, calendar transitions, zodiac signs, the coordination of different temporal systems. All this turns the tower into a model of the world, not just a city accessory. What's before us is no longer a device for people hurrying to market. It's something that was meant to fix the cosmic order. And now, let's ask a question the official version really dislikes. Who exactly translated celestial mechanics into brass and iron? Who made it so that abstract cycles became the rotation of specific axles? Who accumulated observations of such depth to even want to fix them in material? It's one thing to observe the sky with the eyes and build symbolism around celestial phenomena. It's quite another to create a system capable of regularly and coherently displaying these movements within a complex mechanism. This requires not just inspiration and faith. It requires a long school of observation, calculation, comparison, and recording. And here one of the most troubling thoughts appears. What if these clocks weren't just showing the familiar sky of their era? What if they were recording a certain reference point, a specific celestial order, a point of origin, a catastrophic date, the beginning or end of a great cycle? Then what's before us isn't an ornament or even a calendar. Then it's a metallic record of the world, a record left by those who knew. Paper will disappear, memory will fade, cities may be destroyed, but metal and stone will outlast much. And if one allows such a thought even for a second, the next one becomes almost inevitable. Why would ordinary city dwellers even need such a volume of celestial information? This is where the official picture begins to look especially helpless. Because if one looks at these mechanisms soberly, one can't help but notice their informational density is completely mismatched to the daily life of an ordinary city. A person living by earthly affairs needs simple markers. When is dawn? When is noon? When the gates close? When the festival is? When the season changes? That's enough. But astronomical clocks behave as if they are addressed not to the ordinary townsman, but to a person or system for whom long-term alignments, celestial cycles, complex bindings of time and space are important. That is precisely why a chilling theory emerges. Perhaps it was not a service, but an interface, not merely a clock, but a node of a larger logic, a navigation system, a center for calendar synchronization, a control panel for rhythms, or, to put it even more starkly, a timer. Not a timer in the everyday sense, but a civilizational one. Such a device doesn't necessarily need to be convenient for everyone. Its purpose could be entirely different, to mark grand cycles, to remind the initiated of points of convergence, to warn of moments when the world enters a dangerous phase. Look how strangely we've grown accustomed to perceiving such things. If a dial has many symbols, we immediately call it decoration. If death, greed, or vanity are present, we say moralizing. If the zodiac appears, we nod to the era's religious or cultural background. But all of this is too convenient, too lazy, because this version doesn't require explaining why the mechanism is built the way it is at all. It doesn't require answering why a single tower combines a theater, a calendar, astronomy, symbolism, and complex mechanics. Yet the combination of functions is rarely accidental. It is here that the feeling arises that this clock was something like a metallic instruction, a compressed code, a mechanical text that could be read not with letters, but with movement. And perhaps, once, it was read, understood, used. But then another world came, a world that no longer knew how this system truly worked. And so the object remained hanging on the tower, continuing to tick as a reminder of a foreign order. From here, it's just one step to the next thought. The people we know by name as master craftsmen might not have been the creators at all. They could have been later repairmen, tinkering with a legacy whose full meaning they no longer understood. The most inconvenient version for official history is that the known masters might not have been the authors, but merely late interpreters. Not those who created the system, but those who, centuries later, found it damaged, partially non-functional, and tried to restore at least some semblance of life. This thought explains too much. The strange halts of the clock for decades, the long periods when the mechanism existed but did not function properly, the sudden, great restorations, after which the clock seemed to come alive again, but likely not in its original form. Imagine the situation. Before you is an immensely complex machine, built into a tower. It came to you in a world that is technologically beneath the level at which this machine was created. You see gears, axles, dials, figures, transmissions. You understand it's important, that it's ancient, that it's impressive, but you don't understand the entire underlying logic. So, you do what any late heir to foreign technology does. You begin reverse engineering. You try to restore functions from the remnants of form. You replace what you can replace. You simplify what you don't understand. And what you cannot restore, you mask with legend. That's why it's so convenient to tell stories of miracle workers whom no one could replicate. Because replication was likely indeed impossible, not due to some sacred gift, but because the original technological environment had already vanished. And so, the late repairman becomes the creator in the chronicles. History loves such substitutions. It hides the rupture between epochs by overlaying the restorer's name onto an object whose origins run much deeper. Now let's add another crucial detail. If later generations truly didn't fully understand the system's meaning, then many restorations might not have restored the mechanism, but rather cut it down, simplified it, recalibrated it, adjusted it to fit new conceptions of time and the heavens. What we have before us then is not the original, but a mixture of an ancient core and later attempts to tame it. This thought is destructive in itself, but it becomes truly dangerous when we stop counting legends and start counting the real capabilities of the cities credited with creating these monstrously complex systems. History loves beautiful words and hates the calculator. As long as the talk is of inspiration, religious fervor, and miracles of craftsmanship, everything seems almost convincing. But start doing the math and the magic evaporates. We are told such mechanisms appeared in cities whose population, according to official reconstructions, was relatively small. Fine, then let's look not at the legend, but at the task. How many people are needed to build a giant cathedral? How many hands are needed to quarry stone, fell forests, burn lime, transport materials, maintain workshops, feed workers, guard warehouses, sustain metallurgy, manufacture tools, and all while preventing the city from starving to death? And we haven't even gotten to the clocks themselves, because a tower astronomical mechanism is not a separate toy. It's the pinnacle of a pyramid. For it to appear, you need an environment where skilled blacksmiths, foundry workers, carpenters, mathematicians, observers, metal workers, and people capable of assembling and maintaining complex systems already exist. You need ore supplies, you need coal, you need roads, you need warehouses, you need stability. Now overlay this onto a picture of a world where cities are supposedly decimated by epidemics. The economy is fragile, mortality is high, logistics are weak, and the population isn't that large. And here, everything begins to break down. Because such projects are not accomplished by the efforts of a handful of enthusiasts, they require a civilizational surplus, a reserve of people, energy, resources, time, and organization. And if official demography doesn't allow for such a surplus, then a dead end emerges. Either the cities were far more powerful, populous, and well-supplied than we are told, or a significant portion of these structures came to later inhabitants already in finished form. There is almost no third option. The most unpleasant part of this is that demography hits harder than any beautiful theory. With technology, you can still buy time, argue, appeal to genius. But if there aren't enough people even to maintain the infrastructure, let alone create it, then the familiar picture of the past is false at its very foundation. And then, images of old cities become especially eerie, where colossal structures already stand, yet there are almost no people in them, as if someone populated ready-made scenery after the main action had already ended. There is one image that's too easy to miss, though it hits as hard as any engineering argument. It's the old depictions of cities, empty or nearly empty squares, enormous facades, monstrously scaled arches, towers, cathedrals. And against this backdrop, tiny human figures who look not like masters of the space, but like accidental tenants who have wandered into someone else's house. This feeling is hard to unsee once you notice it. The cities seem too large for those who live in them, too wide, too tall, too solemn for the supposedly modest standard of life attributed to them. This feeling is especially strange near tower clocks. The The clock faces are often positioned in such a way that their details are hard to make out from a normal viewing point. A question arises. Why is the city's most important informational instrument displayed as if not intended for convenient reading by the crowd, but for symbolic presence or for some entirely different mode of use? Why do the doors, arches, staircases, and interior volumes of many old buildings give the impression of an environment designed for a different scale of existence? One can attribute this to grandeur, to cult, to a demonstration of power. But the more often this repeats, the weaker such an explanation sounds. It is here that the rather frightening thought of survivors appears, of people who did not build these spaces but occupied them later. They inherited areas that were too large, streets that were too wide, mechanisms on towers that were too complex. They lived amidst an alien logic, gradually inventing new explanations for it. What they didn't understand, they called a symbol. What they couldn't replicate, they declared a unique marvel. What they couldn't restore, they covered with legends. And if you look at history from this angle, much falls into place. We no longer see the smooth development of a city. We see a phase after an event, after a rupture, after a devastation, after the disappearance of those for whom this environment was possibly truly created. But then the next question is inevitable and even heavier. If at the top we see only surviving facades and mechanisms, then what is hidden below? What is concealed beneath the modern street level if these cities truly experienced not evolution, but a catastrophic break? The most frightening turn in this story begins the moment you stop looking up at the clock face and lower your gaze downward, to the base of the tower, to the foundation, to the first tier of old buildings. And what was ignored for too long immediately surfaces. Windows sunken into the ground, doors turned into basement openings, sunken floors, strange transitions between levels. The feeling that modern streets lie not where they were originally supposed to be. We are offered to consider this the slow accumulation of cultural layers. A beautiful explanation, almost convenient, but when such examples become too numerous, it begins to feel strained. Then another version takes the stage, sharp, unpleasant, but explaining much far better. What if a significant portion of old cities was buried not by centuries of daily life, but by one or several powerful, catastrophic events? By flows of earth, mudslides, sedimentary discharges, something that instantly changed the surface level. If so, then many first floors are not first at all. Then the Europe we see is the top layer, the roofs of a surviving world, and the true body of the old infrastructure lies deeper. And here, the clocks on the towers begin to look different. Their height ceases to be merely a question of solemnity. Perhaps it was precisely the upper levels that survived. Perhaps what we see today as the pinnacle of urban architecture was once merely the middle or upper tier of a far more complex system. The lower levels went underground, along with workshops, passages, storage rooms, utilities, perhaps even with the power sources and maintenance systems for these mechanisms. The most unpleasant thing about this version isn't even the version itself, but how many indirect details begin to align in its favor. Underground passages that are hastily walled up, the reluctance to dig deep in historical centers, astonishingly strange building foundations. All this creates a sense that beneath the beautiful tourist show lies another, inconvenient layer of history. And if this layer is connected to a catastrophe, then the tower clocks may not be merely surviving objects. They could be the black boxes of a perished world. And this already leads us to the most disturbing hypothesis of all. What if they continue to count not our sky and not our time? There is a thought that puts everything on a completely different level. What if ancient mechanisms are not mistaken, but simply operate according to a different, original model of the world? We are accustomed to thinking that if old clocks diverge from modern astronomical data or require constant adjustments, it means they are imperfect. But this is a very modern, very self-assured position. We automatically assume that our current celestial order is the only correct standard. But what if it's not? What if the mechanism was calibrated for the sky of another era, for a different configuration of the observable world, for an Earth before a great fracture? Then much takes on a ghastly yet logical form. If a serious cataclysm once occurred, a shift of the axis, a change in tilt, a major geophysical upheaval, the celestial picture for an observer could indeed have changed, and a mechanism created before such an event would continue to count perfectly within its own logic, but would no longer align with the new reality. In that case, ancient clocks are not a faulty instrument, but a frozen map of a former order, a metallic memory of the world before the blow. It is from here that the symbolism of the orloi truly begins to send a chill. The skeleton pulling a rope no longer looks like just a theatrical moral about the transience of life. It becomes a sign of warning, a reminder that death touches not only man, but also epochs, that not only people perish, but entire systems of time, that civilization too can reach its mark and not proceed further. And if the clock was indeed conceived as a device connected to great cycles, then the image of death on the tower is not an artist's joke, but a direct sign of its function. The worst part is that such a version changes our own position in this story as well. We are no longer the descendants of confident progress. We are late observers, people standing beneath a machine whose meaning they do not fully understand. We see the movement of the hands, but we are not sure we know how to read their language. And if that is the case, one last, most dangerous question remains. Why is the theme of these clocks so convenient for simplification, glossing over, and turning into a tourist attraction? Who benefits from us seeing in them only beautiful antiquity and not a possible cycle timer? The most troubling thought in this entire story is not at all that the past has been hidden from us. Something else is far more frightening. Perhaps the very principle of the future has been hidden from us. If we acknowledge that such mechanisms are not merely masterpieces of craftsmanship, but traces of a civilization that lived according to the knowledge of great cycles, then the main fairy tale of modernity collapses. The fairy tale of continuous progress, that we are inevitably moving upward, that the past was primitive and we are the pinnacle of the process. No, then something else emerges. A high order already existed before us. It has already collapsed, and we live not at the beginning of a great journey, but in the long shadow of someone else's fall. That's why it's so convenient to confine the theme of such clocks to museums, guided tours, and decorative admiration. Because if you allow for another interpretation, the question of recurrence immediately follows. If the old world perished inevitably, not by accident, then history is cyclical. Then catastrophe is not an exception, but a phase. Then tower mechanisms might not be monuments to the past, but counters to the next threshold. And it's precisely in this case that the image of the end of a cycle stops being a beautiful metaphor. It becomes a working, terrifying hypothesis. Look how everything converges into a single point. The technology doesn't clash with the era. Demographics don't clash with the scale. Architecture doesn't clash with official daily life. The underground levels hint at a catastrophe. The astronomical logic of the clocks seems too grand for mere city decoration. Each of these things on its own can still be brushed aside, but together they no longer form a random collection of oddities, but a coherent picture. A picture in which the ancient clocks are honest witnesses. They don't explain anything with words. They simply continue their movement, and perhaps that's precisely why they're so frightening. What to do with this knowledge? Don't fall into blind panic and don't repeat memorized formulas. Look, compare, count. Stop perceiving history as a soothing fairy tale. Because the hands don't complete their circle for our convenience. They might be repeating a rhythm that once already ended an entire world. And if that's the case, then the stupidest thing we could do is walk past again, lift our phones, film a nice video, and decide that what's before us are simply old clocks. They are ticking, and in that sound there may be far more truth than in all the polished versions we've been fed for so many years. If this analysis made you look at old towers differently, please like, subscribe, and be sure to hit the bell. Ahead, we'll examine even more traces of a world that may have vanished not so long ago and left us far more warnings than we tend to think.